At 0937 local time, everything looked normal at Iran's Bandar Abbas naval base. Ships sat quietly at their piers. Crews moved through routine checks. The morning haze hung low over the harbor. And then, without warning, the sky turned into a weapon. Because at that exact moment, dozens of cruise missiles were already in the air, skimming just 30 feet above the water, invisible to radar, locked onto every major vessel in the harbor. And the crews below had no idea they were already out of time. Across the Persian Gulf and Gulf of Oman, U.S. destroyers and submarines had launched wave after wave of Tomahawk missiles. Each one followed a pre-programmed path, weaving through open water, carefully spaced to avoid collisions, then cutting toward the Iranian coastline in perfect synchronization. At first, they were just signals on a screen. Then they crossed land. Terrain systems kicked in instantly. The missiles began reading the earth beneath them. Hills, valleys, ridgelines, matching everything to stored maps with terrifying accuracy. It was like driving blind and suddenly recognizing every turn. Inside Bandar Abbas, alarms were just beginning to wake up. On board the frigate Sahand, systems were powering on. Weapons crews rushed to their stations. If they skipped procedures, maybe they could be ready in 3 minutes. They didn't have 3 minutes. They didn't even have 2. At 09:55, the first missile hit. The surveillance feed went white for a split second. Then it came back to a wall of black smoke pouring across the harbor. Fire rolled over the pier, swallowing everything in its path. Secondary explosions erupted as ammunition cooked off, spreading chaos faster than the wind could carry it. The Sahand never fired a single shot. And that's when things almost went wrong, because the second strike wasn't guided by coordinates. It needed to see. The next missile was using a visual targeting system, matching what its camera saw in real time to a stored satellite image. It wasn't looking for a location. It was looking for a shape, a pattern, a perfect match. And now, the entire harbor was disappearing under smoke. If the system couldn't confirm the target, it would choose the closest match available. And in a harbor full of burning wreckage, closest match could mean anything. That meant the next ship, the Sabalan, might survive. Seconds ticked by. 30 seconds. Nothing but black. 45. The smoke started to drift. 75. Shapes began to form. And just over 90 seconds after the first impact, the outline of the Sabalan finally emerged through the haze. It was enough. The missile adjusted in real time and slammed straight into the ship's bridge. Decades earlier, that same vessel had survived a direct hit and made it home. Not this time. The explosion tore through the structure, ending a lifespan that had been running on borrowed time. But by then, the battle had already shifted, because just 3 miles north, something far more dangerous was already moving. A massive converted vessel, used as a floating drone base, was launching attack drones as fast as its systems could cycle. One after another, Shahed drones were being shoved off launch rails, engines screaming to life as they skimmed low over the water. Slow, small, hard to detect, and already heading toward the U.S. fleet operating miles offshore. Within seconds, radar picked them up. Barely. Their signatures were tiny, somewhere between a bird and debris. Easy to miss, harder to track. But they were real, and they were closing. 2 FA-18 Super Hornets were already in position, pushing north at speed. Each carried a weapon designed for a completely different kind of target. But the pilots didn't have time to choose the perfect fight. They had to deal with what was in front of them. The first drone appeared as a faint heat signature against the cold ocean. Barely visible, a missile launched. For a few seconds, nothing happened. Then the drone disappeared in a sudden burst. Gone. Instantly. The second didn't give off enough heat to lock properly, so the wingman got closer. 2 miles out, he switched to guns. A short burst, and the drone shattered midair. The third didn't last much longer. 3 targets down, but the real threat wasn't in the air anymore. It was already inbound, because while the pilots were focused on the drones, a different weapon had already been released. One that didn't need guidance, signals, or even communication. Once launched, it was completely on its own. The LRASM, a long-range missile designed not just to hit targets, but to find them. It didn't broadcast. It didn't rely on GPS. It didn't ask for updates. It listened. As it dropped to low altitude, skimming just above the waves, its sensors picked up everything around it. Radar emissions, communications, electronic noise. It built a picture of the battlefield on its own, and then it chose its target. The drone carrier was still moving, slowly drifting as it continued launching more drones. It didn't matter. To the missile, The difference between expected position and real position was nothing. It closed the distance silently. No warning, no signal. The first impact punched straight through the deck and detonated inside the drone storage area. The second hit moments later at the waterline. The structure couldn't handle it. Within minutes, the massive vessel began to collapse in on itself, listing heavily as water rushed in. It would never launch another drone. But 6 of them had already escaped, and now they were someone else's problem. Because while the harbor was turning into a burning wreck, the most important ship in the region was still alive and preparing to fight. Further east, Iran's flagship sat inside a shallow harbor, armed, operational, and now fully aware of what was happening. Unlike the ships that had been caught off guard, this one had time to activate defenses, time to prepare weapons, time to fight back. And the pilot heading toward it knew something had already gone wrong. The air defenses that were supposed to be destroyed beforehand were still active, which meant he was flying straight into a live defensive zone. Heavy anti-aircraft guns, missile systems, everything waiting for him, and he had one weapon that forced him to stay. In its final phase, the missile he carried would send live video back to his cockpit. He would guide it manually to the target, which meant, once he launched, he couldn't leave. For nearly a full minute, he would have to stay within range of every weapon below. Most pilots would hesitate. He didn't. He released. The missile dropped, accelerated, and headed straight for the harbor. Above, the jet held position, circling just close enough to maintain control. Seconds later, the video feed came alive. Grainy, shaking, but clear enough. The target was centered. Crew members were still moving on deck, running toward weapons stations, trying to bring systems online before impact. He adjusted slightly, aimed lower. Engine room, the weakest point. 3 miles, 2, 1, impact. The explosion tore through the interior, ripping the structure from within. Within moments, the ship began to fail. Water rushed in, systems collapsed, and the flagship settled into the harbor, no longer part of the fight. But the battle wasn't over, because now the biggest threat wasn't a ship, it was the environment itself. A massive vessel nearby was burning, but not sinking, and that made it dangerous. Smoke poured into the sky, spreading across the entire harbor, blocking visibility from above. Targeting systems went blind, and if that burning ship broke loose, it would drift into one of the busiest shipping areas in the world, a floating disaster. Jets moved in to finish it, but a mobile missile system had already repositioned, and it was ready. A missile launched, fast, violent, closing in seconds. The pilot reacted instantly, turning hard, deploying countermeasures. For a split second, it looked like the missile would hit, then it missed. Barely. The response came seconds later. A bomb dropped directly onto the launcher. Gone instantly. With the threat removed, the final strikes hit the burning vessel. This time, it didn't hold. It began to sink. But the damage was already done, because the smoke now covered everything. And hidden inside that smoke were the last remaining ships. No clear targets, no clean shots, only 2 options: guess or go lower. The pilot chose to go lower. Descending through the smoke meant entering the range of shoulder-fired missiles. Small, invisible, deadly. At that altitude, you don't see the threat, you react to it. Through the haze, shapes began to appear. One ship, then another, then a third, all clustered near submarine pens. He didn't hesitate. Bombs released in sequence, each one guided carefully to avoid missing or hitting the wrong target. Explosions tore through the smoke, one after another. When the jet climbed back above the cloud layer, the harbor was no longer operational. Ships were sinking. Infrastructure destroyed. Submarine access crippled. It looked like the fight was over. It wasn't, because the most dangerous units had never stayed in the harbor. They had already left. Fast attack boats, small, fast, heavily armed, had scattered into the Strait of Hormuz the moment the first missiles hit, and they knew exactly how to survive. They blended into commercial traffic, hiding between massive tankers, moving through radar shadows, forcing any attacker to make impossible decisions. Helicopters moved in first, careful, precise, one missile at a time. Each strike had to be perfect. Too close to a civilian ship, and the consequences would be catastrophic. Jets followed, lower, faster. Gun runs replaced missiles. Short bursts, half a second at a time, enough to destroy a target, but controlled enough to avoid hitting anything else. One by one, the boats were taken out, but not all of them. Some escaped into shallow waters, areas too tight, too complex for larger weapons to reach, and they were still armed, still dangerous, still capable of shutting down one of the most critical waterways on the planet. By noon, Bandar Abbas had become a graveyard of burning steel, but the Strait of Hormuz was still alive, still contested, still one mistake away from something much bigger. Because this wasn't a clean victory, it was just the opening move. If this kept you on the edge of your seat, subscribe for more real-world military breakdowns. Like the video, and I'll see you in the next one.